Welcome to the Caledonian Elixir. From Glasgow, Scotland, welcome to the Caledonian Elixir. I'm your host, Vincent, and you can find us on YouTube, Facebook, Twitter X, and Rumble. And you can also get us as a podcast on Spotify. And if you want to support us, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. So I hope you're all well. It's been a stormy few days in Scotland, but that's autumn for you in the north of Britain. So, welcome back to returning viewers. And for all of you finding us for the first time, we're a podcast and do call in shows on everything from politics to the paranormal, told with wit and true grit, with guests and callers. So, today on the Alexa, we've got a special guest, Whitley Strieber, joining us in a minute. Whitley is a best-selling author of works of fiction and non-fiction, such as Hunger, Communion, and many others that have cemented his place, I think, in the paranormal as one of the most creative thinkers and storytellers alive today. However, Whitley is also an experiencer with what many consider alien contact, and it's an honour to have him on. So, without further ado, Will Strieber. Hello, Whitley. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can. I can hear you very well.
And how are you today?
Well, fine, thank you.
As I was saying to you before, I want to approach this by asking you some questions that have formed in my mind when reading your literature over the years. And I was first introduced to your work when I was probably around 10, when I was a kid, when my father rented the movie Communion starring Christopher Walken. And, Christopher Walken's performance in that show alone, that film alone, freaked me out. But there's a joke I like to make about Christopher Walken that regardless of what film he's in, he always plays himself, Christopher Walken. However, that film adaptation was based on your book Communion. And after I saw that movie, I had to get a copy of your book, and I'm not sure if it was your use of description, but that story genuinely disturbed me. And this was round about the time the TV series X-Files debuted for me, so it was sort of in vogue. So I'm well aware of your background, but for the audience, could you just describe yourself in a general way, and we'll get into your literature later?
Yeah, sure. My name is Whitley Strieber. Uh, I'm 180 years old. Uh, Actually, no, I'm not. I'm younger than that. I am the author of many books. My first book was called The Wolf, and it was published in 1979. It became a movie. My second book was called The Hunger, published a couple of years later. It also became a movie. The Wolfman starred, The Hunger starred Catherine Deneuve and Susan Sarandon.
Hmm.
Um, then I published quite a few works of fiction. One of them, Superstorm, became a movie called The Day After Tomorrow.
Mm.
And I had a bizarre experience, apparently a close encounter of the third kind, in the last few days of 1985. Wrote a book about that called Communion, which was also made into the movie you were referring to. And
And I would like to
um,
ask you a question about your experiences between the period of October and December 1985 a little later.
my experiences uh, with the close encounter experience, you mean?
Yeah, I would like to ask you about that a little later if I can. But just right now, it's just to provide a background for my audience who aren't aware of who you are.
Yeah, okay. The close encounter experience happened in December of 1985, the night after Christmas, and it was a complete surprise. I had no idea anything like that could happen to anyone. And I found myself in a room of what looked to me like gigantic insects, and I was completely confused. It seemed to me like it was a dream, a nightmare actually, but I couldn't wake up from it, and it came to seem very real very quickly. And I was injured as well because of the struggle I went through. And um, the next morning, I remembered something had happened, and I remembered seeing an owl because seen these beings with these great big black eyes, and I was trying to make sense of it. Over the next few days, the memories came back, and I decided I had some kind of a psychotic break because the idea of aliens just didn't occur to me.
Hmm.
And I mean, who would think of that? And um, I was injured, and I went to the doctor. I found out I had been raped, which I remembered happening, and there's also an injury in the side of my head where a
Hmm.
needle had been put into my head. And since these physical injuries had happened, the doctor recommended that I have a thorough examination, including an MRI scan of my brain to see if anything had been done to it, and that we could detect. And we did all of that. I also enlisted the New York State Criminal Investigation Division. I was in New York at the time because, again, the idea of it being anything to do other than with a human intervention of some sort uh, was not not on my radar. And they sent someone out who looked around but said, I have no evidence, and you have no way to describe the individuals who did this because apparently they were wearing masks, which is what I had thought.
Hmm.
And there's no evidence. In other words, there was no forensic evidence because they took you out of your house, and we don't have any way of determining where you went or anything. So I enlisted the help. My brother had sent me a book called uh, Science and the UFOs by a British author called Jenny Randalls. And I was reading the book after Christmas. It was a Christmas gift. And to my surprise, toward the end of it, there was a couple of paragraphs about alien abduction. And I thought to myself, this is so odd because it seems like what I remember but that's what I remember happening. It's a very good description of what I remember happening. So that's the first time that idea came into my head. And there was a researcher in America called Bud Hopkins who was mentioned in the article in the book. And so I got in touch with him, and my wife and I went over to his house. He lived also in New York City. And he was convinced that I'd been abducted by an alien, and I thought that was ridiculous. I thought the whole thing was a complete farce, laughable.
Mhm.
And he wanted to hypnotize me, and I thought, my God, I'm certainly not going to be hypnotized by somebody who believes this nonsense. And I said, no, I, I would prefer not to do that. But if you found a professional or a psychiatrist I could talk to, I would appreciate it. Because I was at that point extremely confused. I had been injured, I'd been raped, and I had this needle had gone to the side of my head. The doctor
Mhm.
had confirmed that I had the rectal injury. It was real. And I, Mr. Uh, Hopkins recommended a very prominent psychiatrist, Dr. Donald Klein, who was the head of the New York State Department of Psychiatry and also happened to be one of the leading forensic hypnotists in the world. And I consulted with him, and we were both laughing about Hopkins and his beliefs because they were so outlandish. And but I still wanted to know what had happened because I had been attacked. Clearly, I'd been assaulted by someone, and they'd gotten into the house as well, into our little country house, which we had thought of as being such a peaceful place. So it was very annoying and upsetting. And I was concerned about taking my family back there and so forth. So he said, well, I can try forensic hypnosis because I am, and he showed me a list of cases he had solved in this way. Uh, 72 cases where people had been knocked down by automobiles, for example, and he was able to help them remember the license numbers and the type of automobile and so forth. And so it was obvious that he knew what he was doing, and he was one of the world's leading psychiatrists as well. So I said, yes, let's do that, and maybe we can get some sort of information. And we were both sort of laughing at Bud, who was very eager to make a recording and convinced it was an alien abduction and everything. But we didn't laugh into his face exactly. We certainly didn't expect anything like that to emerge in the hypnosis, but it did. It was much more clear under hypnosis than it had been in my memory, but it was the same thing. I remembered exactly. And I thought to myself afterwards, my God, what in the world is this about?
Mhm.
And that's where it started. Now, all of these years later, I've had a relationship with these strange beings now for many years. I've written quite a few books about them. I'm relatively comfortable with having them in my life. When people are working with me, they will sometimes enter their lives too, but it's not like that. It's much more gentle now. And I'm used to them. They are here. And, so what? It's a big universe.
Mhm.
Why not?
Yeah.
And, people always say, well, they're willing to talk about the UFOs, which in the United States, for some strange reason, they're now called UAPs.
Mhm.
Um, um, but, oh no, we mustn't talk about this.
Mhm.
This is the forbidden subject. But, if they are here from another world and they're not, I would be more worried if they weren't interested in us, if they are. Because if they weren't interested in us, that would mean, what would it mean? I mean, it would mean that we just were, what, a real
Mhm.
failure or simply a bore. But they're very interested in us.
And you reported several different groups of aliens that were involved in your experience. I
Y-
can recall when you
Yeah, yeah.
and yeah.
I can tell you very precisely what I remember in that regard. On that night, in the little, I didn't see the outside of it, so I can only say it was a small room that I was in. Although my impression, a neighbor of mine did see it from the outside that night, and so we know it was a UFO floating above a field near our houses because he and his wife saw it. They were passing by after a very late night party at about 2 in the morning, and they saw this thing hanging in the field, and they thought it was the Goodyear blimp, which is
Mhm.
a, a advertising blimp that goes around in this country. And they thought he was a former state police officer, and he thought, my goodness, 2 o'clock in the morning on a snowy night, and the blimp's down there. It's obviously crashed. I need to go see if I can help them. And he got out of the car and was trudging across the field, which was full of snow. And he heard screaming from inside the thing,
Mm.
which was, of course, me, because I was screaming like hell. I remember it very well. And it certainly had these lights turned on all over it. It made a growling noise and came toward him. And he got scared and jumped back in his car and drove away. And he came to the cabin about a year later and said, "Whitley, I'm so embarrassed that I didn't help you." And I said to him, "Ray, if you had tried to help me, you might have, God knows what would have happened to either or both of us. So it's just as well, and I'm still here." In any case,
Yeah.
um, it had, I did not know what to make of them.
You
In other
must you
words,
must have been you must have been terrified. Sorry for interrupting. I remember that you wrote in communion that yourself, your ego, didn't survive that journey into that room.
no, no, it was absolutely extraordinary. I was completely stripped of everything and screaming like like an animal in an extremist. And they had a voice that it was clearly some kind of mechanical voice that kept repeating the phrase, "What can we do to help you stop screaming?"
Mhm.
Which was, "Get away, get me out of this room full of giant insects." That would
Yeah.
certainly help. Um, so it was,
And you asked to smell
yeah, I
the
asked to
bean.
smell them because at one point, because I couldn't believe that they were real.
Yeah.
I did not remember that until the hypnosis, though, because it was buried in my memory. And one of them said, "Oh, okay, I can do that," in a sort of breathy voice. And later on, I found out they don't actually have vocal cords. They can't talk
Mhm.
like we can. They talk telepathically, and which is easy to do when you're with them. And I wish it was easy to do now, but it's not. It's next to impossible for me, at least. But I suppose maybe other people can do it. But when you're with them, that's all you do. You talk in your head. You don't talk physically. They don't talk physically.
So I'd just like to play a short clip of someone who encountered one of those beings. If you could play clip one, please.
They looked like dolls. They looked so incredible that I couldn't believe what I was seeing. My mind faintly registered the spectacle. I wasn't even scared, just mildly surprised and stupefied. These things were moving towards me. There were 5 of them, and before I knew what was happening,
I think the clip on my end is did that play okay for you? Did you save
Yeah,
that?
I saw it.
I caught it a bit early because it's pausing and starting on my end, but I believe that interview was conducted by the late Professor Mack, professor of psychiatry at Harvard.
Yeah,
And the
John
reason,
Mack, I knew him well.
yeah, and the reason I played that was just to highlight how pervasive these encounters are across cultures. That no matter what nation or continent that you are from, persons across the world have encountered beings similar to what you're describing essentially.
Yes. Well, I think that there's a question here. Is it that only some people encounter them? Or is it that only some people remember encountering them? Is it that all of us encounter them? Are they simply part of life or not? But I want to get back to the different forms I've seen because I sort of digressed there, and I didn't really answer your question.
Yes.
So may I go back to that?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Go ahead,
Yeah.
please.
Okay. I've seen the following forms. I've seen the grays, the ones with the big black eyes. I've seen them in two manifestations. One about 5 feet tall and one smaller, about 3 feet tall. And the 3 foot tall ones seem to be kind of ruled by the 5 foot tall ones, and they may even be robotic. I'm not sure. The 5 foot tall ones are certainly not robotic. Um, then I have seen these squat, dark blue figures, which not many people mention, but I've seen them quite a few times. And then I have met one of the ones that are so-called Nordics, and conversed with him in normally. He looked like a human being. He's rather tall and a little peculiar, I
Mhm.
guess, a lack of normal emotional affect. He clearly wasn't on the same frequency that we are. But I met him in a context that was where I could be certain of what he was.
Mhm.
And he told me a very interesting thing. He said, "You must never start a war with the Greys, because if you do, they will never let you stop fighting, and they will never let you win." And so every time I see the U.S. Air Force shooting at them, I think that's probably a mistake.
Mhm.
Um, and then I've seen the so-called tall whites, which was a very interesting experience. I woke up in the living room of my house, my apartment in New York. This was in about 1989. And I found myself face to face with two very tall people who were so tall that they were actually leaning over like this in order to stand in the room. And they were much higher than our ceiling, even. And they asked me, this was in the middle of the tour that I was doing for Commune, going on the radio and the television and so forth, and just being beat up mercilessly. I was really being raked over the coals because no one believed me. They thought it was all a big nonsense and I was out for the money or whatever. Now, I wish I was out for the money. If you saw this apartment, you would know immediately there was no money in it. Very little anyway. There was a lot at the first, but you get a lot of money once in your life, and then
Mhm.
have an entire life without much money. You don't actually have a lot of money. Anyway, they said, "What can we do to help you?" And I blurted out, and my wife nearly beat me up for this. I blurted out, "You could show me one of your children." And when I told her that the next morning, she said, "Why in the world did you ask for that?" I said, "Anne, I don't know. It just came out that way." And then we figured, well, it was a stupid failure on my part and forgot about it. About a month later, I was at the old Denver airport. It's been replaced, but it was called Stapleton Airport at the time. And the following thing happened. Went to the baggage claim area to get my suitcases and to meet the person who was going to take me on that leg of the author tour there in Denver. And I was waiting for my suitcases when suddenly a man I knew to be associated with the Defense Department, but I had no idea he was involved in anything like this, showed up with a what to my eye was a gray, obviously heavily disguised, wearing a cheap dress and what looked like a wig you might have bought in a jumble sale, and some thick wax-like makeup and dark glasses. And this bizarre couple had with them what looked like a little boy who was about the size of the gray, about 5 feet tall, but had the features of a little child.
Mhm.
And they walked right out into the middle of the crowd. They weren't secretive. They were carrying golf bags of all things. And I'm looking at them and I'm thinking that really does look strange because I recognized the man and the people with him were so bizarre. I thought, what in the world could this be about? And suddenly the heavily disguised gray and the giant little boy isn't this extraordinary? I mean, I'm telling you a real story. It's not made up. Began to play patty cake. And after a moment, their hands were moving so fast, it sounded like a machine gun. You couldn't see their hands. They were moving like blazing speed. Everyone in the baggage claim area gathered around watching this. It was a real phenomenon, an extraordinary thing. And then they stopped, and the little boy sort of bopped a couple of times like it was still in the rhythm of it. And laughing, he turned and walked toward the wall. And the next thing we knew, he was disappeared. And I looked back, and the man and woman were gone too. And the man beside me said, "Did you see that?" I said, "Yeah, I sure did." And he said, "Let's go have a drink. Let's talk about this. I've never seen anything like it in my life." At that moment, my ride appeared. And I went out with her, and we were riding out of the airport. And I thought, my God, they showed me one of their children.
Mm.
These incredibly tall people showed me one of their enormous children. Isn't that amazing? And it's an amazing world we live in. And we just,
Mhm.
half your audience is probably saying, "Oh, that's got to be a story. It can't be true." But it's true.
Well, Whitley, I would like to quote from two of your novels, two of your books, and it's germane to what I want to ask you next. In Communion, and I believe Communion was published in 1987, you wrote, "Maybe the visitor experience is what happens when the human mind looks into the mirror and discovers that its own reflection is real and fearful." However,
Yeah.
one moment, in a much more recent publication, in the book Them, published in 2023, you wrote, "This book is an attempt to look at this situation seriously and deeply by exploring the way human lives are being impacted. It does not address the argument about whether or not the visitors are aliens. There is no proof of that." So to me, and correct me if I'm wrong, there has been a reticence, a sort of uncertainty on your part as to what these visitors could be. And that's apparent from your literature, highlighted by the quotes I just read out. At this point in your life in 2025, would you identify the visitors as aliens?
No, I don't know what they are. In order for me to identify them as the aliens, I'd have to know where they came from. And I don't know that. They could be anything. I can tell you, I could give you quite a list of things they could be other than aliens from another planet. However, given that the fact that the conservative estimate that there are 27, I think it's 27 sextillion trillion planets in the universe, I think the odds are good that they are from a planet. But that's only the odds. It's such an extraordinary universe and so big. What if parallel universes are
Mhm,
real? Then they could be from one of those. And the reason I say that is that we know that the universe is really enormous. And we know that moving from one part of it to another, even at light speed, is incredibly, just remarkably slow. To
yeah.
get to the nearest star takes years. So at the speed of light, and we're not even sure anything can move that fast that has mass.
Mhm,
So, uh, but, and then you think, well, perhaps a wormhole. But if you read Stephen Hawking's paper, he wrote a couple of papers on wormholes. You find that the difficulty is there are two difficulties. The first one is that even if it is created, it will be so unstable that it can't last but for more than just not even a second. And the second part is, if you can imagine the thick armor of a battleship, this thick, in order to bend the battleship armor like this, you have to have more strength than is in that armor.
mhm.
convert and in order to bend the universe so that two parts of it that are distant from either touch each other, you obviously have to have more energy than is in the universe. So that makes that seem like a rather unlikely possibility, but it's not so difficult. If parallel universes or other universes exist to tunnel from one universe to another, that might not be so difficult. So it might not be so energy intensive. In fact, there are some studies that suggest it might be not just a non-critical level of energy necessary.
And when you
Uh,
when you read books such as Passport to Magonia, written by Jacques Vallée,
yes,
there's a description implication that these beings have existed here alongside us for centuries.
yes, I know. Jock and I have been friends for many years. We're close friends, and I couldn't agree with him more. I think that the book is of absolutely seminal importance in this whole field. That uh, we have to look at this as something that has been part of us for a long time. And as we were discussing at the beginning of the show, what if this is everybody that's involved? What if this isn't an alien incursion or an incursion from another universe or anything like that? What if it is simply part of what we are? That they are a part of what we are. And that's why we see them as we do.
And
Passport?
that goes to, your quote from Communion, that the visitor
Yes.
experience is what happens when the human mind looks at itself in the mirror and discovers what it sees as fearful.
Yeah. Well, that quote comes from reading Passport to Magonia. Actually, I read the book
Right.
before I wrote Communion. And Anne and I were with Bud Hopkins, who was telling the story of how this was aliens from another planet. And he said, well, there's example is this French author, Jacques Vallée, uh, has a book out that's just exactly the sort of thing we don't need, which is the idea that it has something to do with fairy folk and so forth and so on. And as soon as we left the house, Anne said, we're getting that book right now. Let's go down to the bookstore.
Mm.
And we did. And we both read it many times and got into contact with Jacques. And I'm going to see Jacques in a few weeks, in fact, in Italy. And as I say, we're very good friends. And I think it's probably the most important book on the subject ever written.
Yeah, I would agree that you and yourself and Jack Verley are the two best writers alive today,
Oh, well,
um,
thank you.
on the subject. But Willie, one thing that is often credited as evidence of alien abduction are the implants that are often found in the bodies of abductees. And the
Yes,
late Dr. Roger Lear, and I'm aware that you knew him personally too, he performed a lot of work extracting these implants, and he
yes,
described some of them as emitting RMF, radio waves. So to me, I've struggled to understand why aliens would implant abductees with objects that emitted FM radio waves. And instead, this always reminded me of biotelemetry in a documented case of a man called Robert Nasland. Now, with Robert Nasland, he was assaulted and he blanked out. He couldn't recall much of his assault. But in the months that followed, he suffered from deteriorating health, mental health, and deteriorating physical health, headaches, poor cognitive function, poor memory. So after some time, he had an X-ray examination that revealed foreign anomalous objects in his frontal lobe of his brain. And the people connected to his case, including his doctor, confirmed that these objects were transmitting radio waves. And he had them, removed, and they were theories that was done for radio intracerebral mind control. However, their belief that it was done not by aliens, however, the people that assaulted him months previous, and you too have an implant, and if my memory serves me, that you no longer think that your implant is the result of alien technology. Could you describe how it got there and its purpose?
Yes, I can. Uh, it got there on a May night in 1989. Uh, I was lying in bed reading. My wife had just gone to sleep. The windows this was the cabin in upstate New York. The bedroom had windows that opened out onto the back deck and out over the driveway, which was made of shale. Uh, Farther away down the driveway, there was a big gate, which was locked. And all of a sudden, about 11 o'clock, I heard the crunch of gravel in the driveway, but there were no lights. So I was immediately alarmed because it meant that there was a vehicle out there and without lights on, and it had gotten past the locked gate. So I started to come. I started to move toward there was the bank of light switches at the cabin, and you could raise them all at once, and all of these floodlights would go on all around the cabin. Uh, and I moved toward that, and as I moved toward that, I heard a male voice in the backyard say, "Condition red." And I saw standing in the doorway of the bedroom at the foot of the bed a man and a woman, and not aliens. They were a man and a woman. There might have been something behind them too, and for all I know, it could have been an alien. But I saw a man and a woman, and so instead of the lights, I started to move toward the shotgun that was under the bed. I was well prepared. I was very nervous in those days, as you may imagine.
Mm,
Um, and being in America and from Texas, my first instinct was to gun up, which I had done.
mhm,
I regret to say. In any case, they ran forward, and the next thing I knew, I was lying on my right side. I couldn't see anything. I couldn't move a muscle. Something began pressing my head down into the bed, like this, into the pillow, and the woman's voice was speaking very gently. I remember all of this very clearly. And then it ended. There was a great flash of light and a crashing in the woods, like they were all running out through the woods. And I jumped up, opened the drawer in the little table beside the bed, and grabbed the pistol, because there was a pistol there too, and ran off into the house, noting that the alarm system had not been tripped. It was still red, it was still turned on. And I went all through the house. There was no breach of the alarm system anywhere. And so I ended up sitting on the side of the bed thinking, what has happened here? I had heard of lucid dreams. I'd heard of lucid dreams and every kind of nightmare and trance, and you can imagine hallucination. But this had really seemed very real. And I told Anne about it in the morning, and she said, "Well, uh, did they put an implant in your ear because of the pressing?" And we knew Roger Lear already. We'd been to some implant surgeries.
mhm.
And so it wasn't a secret, and I wasn't necessarily. And indeed, we could feel this thing. It began to hurt later that day, and I did reach up, and I felt this here. I'm feeling it right now. It's here, and so I was horrified. Oh, I had the alarm man come, and we looked over the whole system. It had been breached. That with a very high intensity magnetic field. Clearly, someone had come in, and clearly the thing was damaged.
When exactly did this happen? Can you
May
remember
of
what year?
May of yeah, May of 1989. In one of my books, it says 92, but it's a typographical error. It was definitely May of 1989.
So this
Uh,
is this is just 2 years after the events. Uh, no, 4 years
well,
after
no,
the
in
event.
4 years.
Yeah.
It's they happened in 1986.
Hmm.
So it was just 3 years after, just going on for 3.5 years after. Um, unless my math is wrong, which it could be.
Yeah.
Uh,
So I mean, that hardly sounds like a coincidence that these
it
events
was.
happened so
Oh
soon
no,
after.
it wasn't a coincidence. The
Yeah.
implant is part of my life now. I wouldn't trade it for anything. It's an essential tool in my life. But at the time, my first instinct was, I want to get this out of me because they're tracking me now. And Anne said, no, no, don't let's see if we can figure out what it's there for, because they put it in for some reason. And I said, yeah, but it's my ear, not yours.
Mhm.
And she said, Whitley, no one is going to be interested in tracking you for very long. You go down to the shops and you get the papers and the groceries and you sit in a room and write. And
Mhm.
that is not going to, you don't go to hardly even any shows or anything. So, no, I wouldn't, that doesn't matter in any way. That can't be why it's there. And years passed. But 1992, no, I guess it was 94 came along. And we were then in Texas. And I met a doctor who was interested sort of in this stuff. And he did not know I had an implant in me. But so I said to him, well, we were talking and chatting, and he'd asked a little bit about communion, but we were now on other subjects, mostly a social friendship. And I said, by the way, Anne had said to me many times, I don't want you to have it taken out. And you're not to, under any circumstances, ask Roger to take it out or get it taken out. And I
Mhm.
had agreed to that. But then I said to the doctor, I have this little cyst in my ear. Can you feel it? And he felt it. And he said, yeah, that's a little cyst. I can pop that out for you tomorrow morning in my office. Come on in the morning. And after Anne was furious, but I said, I have to try, Anne. It's been here all these years now, and we don't know a thing about it. We have no idea what it does. And I find it creepy. So we went to the office. We made a video of all of this, which is on my website, unknowncountry.com. The doctor opened up a little incision on the object, and as soon as he touched it with the edge of his scalpel, it went from here down in under the skin into my earlobe
Mhm.
to escape from the scalpel. At that point, he realized, wait a minute, this is an alien implant. It's no cyst. And he said, I'm pulling out. And he made a little stitch in it, and that was that. And I went home. And Annie said, well, now you know you're never going to get it out unless they take off your whole ear. And 2 days later, there was a burning sensation and it went up from my earlobe back up here. Now, the surgery is videotaped. And in the videotape, both Anne and the surgeon see a white disc, and the surgeon gets a little corner of it off with the scalpel. And then they see it disappear and go down. So that's all videotaped with two witnesses. It happened, in other words. Now, he sent the fragment to the lab, and the lab technician called him and said, is this a practical joke? And he said, no, it came out of a patient's ear. And he said, because this is a piece of metal, this is not biology entirely, it's partly technology. There is a metal base and cilia are attached to it and they are motile. They can move, in other words. And of course, that the cilia is what enabled it to move, to escape down into my earlobe. Years passed with nothing, no idea. Every once in a while there'd be a ringing noise, the air would turn bright red. Then Annie passed away, and the following things happened. A slit opened up in my right eye, and I could see typewriting coming through it. My own writing process became incredibly enhanced. And eventually, a doctor connected with the Central Intelligence Agency wanted a look at it. So he arranged for me to get a CAT scan of it. And 2 days before the CAT scan, two men showed up here at this flat and offered to explain the thing to me and asked me to be sure not to have it taken out. They said it had been invented by a man called Konstantin Rodove, and that it was a research tool. And what I was seeing in this slit with the words coming through were my own memories being pulled up from deep inside my memory banks in relation to what I was thinking about. In other words, a very sophisticated internal research tool. And um, which was very impressive to me. Then after they left, I looked up this name, Konstantin Rodove. And it turns out he was an expert in something called electronic voice communication with the dead. And now, look back to what I've told you before. People put it in. People put it in. People came to tell me not to get it taken out. And it was invented by a person. Now, this gets way back to where we started. Who are they? Are they aliens from another planet, or is this something very, very different? The answer is clear. It's something very, very different. I cannot tell you what, but it's something very, very different. And the implication is even that it involves our own dead, and that they aren't gone either, and that we are sitting here in a little corner of reality, pretending it's all there is. And isn't that silly?
Uh, uh, yeah, it is. And in terms of, you know, people being involved, when I hear of cases where implants are used, and it takes me back to the Congressional Church Committee. They disclosed files, and I think it was back in the 1970s where they revealed a sub-project of MK Ultra 119 that was a chip, an implant that could be used in order to control human thought, human behavior.
They looked like dolls.
Sorry, however, you're alluding to that it involves not intelligence agencies per se, but it's much deeper, that it transcends that. That this, in fact, could involve the dead, the afterlife.
It certainly could. It could be anything. We're not far enough along to be able to make a decision. And people are very quick to decide they know what it is, because nobody likes unanswered questions or unanswerable questions. And this is both. But
Yeah,
I'll tell you another story about an implant, not my own. I was friends with the members of the family of the man who founded a big scientific institute in Texas, the Southwest Research Institute, and they have every conceivable piece of metallurgical analysis equipment that exists. And the head of the equipment of the uh, uh, materials analysis department was a good friend. The result of this was that when I moved to Texas, Roger Lear started sending us implants to analyze there. One of them was incredibly interesting. They were all interesting. They were all basically pieces of fragments of meteoric iron, and some magnetized, most magnetized, some not. But they were encased in epidermal tissue that had been buried in deep muscle. Now, that is an absolute smoking gun, because the human body does not have the genetic coding to create epidermis inside deep muscle. That had to have been done artificially.
Mm.
But its effect was that the body's only seeing the epidermis, it's not seeing the object. And so the object's not going to be rejected, it'll just sit there. Now, this one implant, it may even be one that you were talking about, the same one you were talking about, I don't know. It had been emitting a low level signal on the FM frequency,
Mm-hmm.
which had been recorded. Um, so we thought that perhaps there would be some kind of a crystalline structure in it that would explain why it could emit a radio wave on a certain specific frequency, which is what it was doing. So we scanned it under the scanning electron microscope and confirmed that it was basically a nickel iron meteoric fragment like all of the others. But then we took it to the X-ray diffraction machine on the theory that if there was a crystalline formation in there, we might be able to pick it up with X-ray diffraction. And the diffractor, what it does is it creates an image by making many images, is circling. The X-ray will circle the object in question many times and gradually creates an image. And when this is a piece of iron, nearly pure iron, so it's going to definitely be there's going to be definitely an X-ray return on it for sure. And the first time it goes around, there's an X-ray return, and you hear the machine beep. Second time it goes around, same thing, an X-ray return, the machine beeps. Third time, silence. So we run it for a few minutes and no more diffraction. So we stop the machine, take it back to the SEM, and it's exactly the same consistency as it was before, nickel iron. Nothing's changed. We left it in the X-ray diffraction machine for 36 hours, and that piece of nickel iron had become X-ray invisible. And we have no idea why. Nothing we did with it subsequently could reveal why it could not be detected anymore. There was no X-ray signal bouncing off of it, even though it was clearly a piece of nickel iron. Now, that is an example right there of ultra-high technology. Unfortunately, the other side of the Southwest Research coin is half of their budget comes from the Central Intelligence Agency and the United States Defense Department, with the result that the implant soon disappeared.
Well, that sort of introduces the concept, the idea of MyLabs, where you have individuals who describe the military or members of intelligence who accompany abductions. They're involved in abductions. You know, there are those who believe that the abductions are a screen memory for military interference in their life. In fact, I have Eva Lorgen on next week. I don't know if you're familiar with her, but she's a MyLab advocate. And yeah, I mean, do you know what? I would like to play another clip. Could you play clip 2, please?
I can also tell you, and this might sound crazy, but based on our investigations and stuff that we've seen, okay, there is definitely something that I think would rival what we know currently with physics, and a tech that potentially is out there that we don't have the ability to reproduce, because it would basically be like dropping a cell phone right off back during the time of maybe caveman. So like we just don't have the tech to develop it yet. What I can also tell you is, based on our interviews, and this has been something that you can go back and watch with the congressional hearings, but I was actually able to ask some of the witnesses, you know, what are these things? And they keep saying interdimensional. And then when you talk about the interdimensional aspect of, you know, are these things pre-existing, maybe outside of what we currently know as our own dimension? That stuff can kind of all sound crazy, but at the end of the day, you know, my job as an investigator is to receive all the information, decipher it, and then ultimately, from a congressional aspect, if you do.
You know, I believe that was Congresswoman Luna. What do you think? What do you think of it? And that was on the Joe Rogan show. And what do you think of the role of the elected government in all of this? Do you think they're willfully subservient to a deep state that's involved in keeping this a secret? Because we've had Project Blue Book, the Condon Report, the more recent congressional committees on UAPs. And to me, Whitley, disclosure still seems something that's not tangible. It does. It seems more like it's been played as a film. So I guess I've got two questions. What do you think the role of elected government is in this, and what is disclosure?
And so far, the role of elected government in this is to been to run along behind it, trying to pick up crumbs, uh, which is not much. Back in the 90s, I was involved with the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence, who were trying to get the National Security Agency to open up about this, and they used me to help them generate questions, and it was not successful.
I wasn't
Uh,
aware of that. Could you describe that
no,
a bit more?
it's not it's not generally it's not generally known publicly.
Right,
It wasn't it was the hearings weren't classified, but they were restricted.
right.
And I'm at liberty to say I was doing it, but I never signed any kind of confidentiality agreement. But they haven't been published. Nothing's been published about them,
Okay.
and I would think nothing will. It's been now a long time ago. It's irrelevant compared to what's being done now. It's far more
Mm,
extensive and far more effective. So people like Representative Luna have done a lot more than anyone ever did back in the 90s.
mm,
So, or back in the 60s when Admiral Hillenkoetter tried to do the same thing. But I think that this Defense Department will stand fast. And I think that most of the material that is of interest has already been offloaded into the defense contractor uh, uh, space, so that even if the Defense Department is forced to open its files, there's not going to be anything in them. So this is, and this gets me to what Representative Luna was referring to, which is the same thing that Richard Dolan talks about, the deep state. There's something, or rather, he calls it the breakaway civilization.
mhm,
There's something out there. The people who came and put this in my ear, they were people just like you and me. At least that's what they looked like. Where did they come from? How did they? How did the car work? How did they open the house, the garage up and leave an incredibly powerful magnetic field there, so powerful that even with the door wide open, the switch wasn't tripped that should have
mm.
tripped the alarm. How did they do those things? All of
Sorry,
it.
are you aware of Joseph Farrell?
I know him. Yeah, I know Joseph. He's been on my show on Dreamland many
Right.
times.
He wrote an excellent book that describes how there's a breakaway civilization.
I think he's fascinating. I think he's a
Yeah.
brilliant man.
Yeah. You know, I'd like to transition us away from, aliens, visitors, UAPs, because there's so much more to your literature than just that. And for example, you've been warning of the looming threat of nuclear war for a long time. In fact,
Yes,
you wrote a book called War Day many a
yes,
moon ago regarding that. And today, we we live in a perilous situation with a conflict in Eastern Europe involving a nuclear superpower that, in effect, is really a proxy war between NATO and Russia. We had a brief skirmish there between two nuclear powers, Pakistan and India, not long ago, and we have the potential threat of a new war between Iran and Israel on the horizon. Um, do you think we're closer to nuclear war now than any time in your life?
if conditions remain as confused as they are among as many nuclear powers as they are, a nuclear exchange of some kind is inevitable. in the world.
Mhm.
What form it will take, whether it would evolve into a world destroying conflict or not, I don't know. But there will be such an exchange at some point, but by somebody. I don't know who. It could be that the Israelis will decide that the Iranians have got a missile that could deliver a nuclear weapon to Israel. And Israel is so small that one small nuclear weapon detonated over Tel Aviv would ruin Israel forever. They will preempt any chance of that. And they will do it with a nuclear weapon if they have to.
Mhm.
Uh, Pakistan and India are right now the, the parts of the two countries that control the nuclear weapons are very stable. But that might not necessarily always be true, because Pakistan is especially is a fundamentally unstable country. Um, uh, Russia, if its back is up to against the wall, will it lash out with a
Mhm.
nuclear attack in Ukraine? That's also possible. The UK is extremely vulnerable to various different types of nuclear attack. Would the UK under if there was an attack on the Ukraine become afraid that Russia might launch high speed, ultra high speed nuclear tipped missiles that would reach the UK before the UK could react and preempt there. There are
Yeah,
so
yeah.
many.
Sorry for interrupting. I mean, there are new missiles such as the Ureshnik missile that Russia has recently deployed in Belarus that would take just 5 minutes if launched to reach the UK. And
This is what I'm referring to.
yeah,
This is a destabilizing and foolish move. But that gets back to the fact that Russia is a dictatorship and run by a man who is destabilizing and foolish by nature. And then that gets to the United States. The president of the United States is a very strange individual with extremely strange ideas on a lot of different levels. And he's old and does not seem to be very mentally sharp. That's not a good place to play. That's not a good hand in which to place a nuclear trigger. So I think the situation is as unstable as it can be without nuclear war breaking out. And I would assume that within the next few years, there will be at least one nuclear exchange. I hope not.
yeah, because once that, you know, once that rabbit is out the hat, once Pandora's box is opened, how do you close it? Because
Well, exactly.
you have that escalation ladder, and if one superpower uses a nuclear bomb to contain that, seems very unlikely.
Once in the beginning of World War One, once the Germans began to call up their reserves and board them onto trains, everyone else had to do the same because if they hadn't, their borders would have been, the Germans could have simply walked across. And that caused the war, that terrible war to start. It was the mechanics of geopolitics that made it inevitable. And
Mhm.
we're in a very similar situation right now, with the difference that it is exponentially more complex than it was then, and the stakes are exponentially higher.
I have one more question for you before we finish this. Um, you also have a podcast called Dreamland, and years ago, my partner and I would listen almost every week when a new episode dropped. And I say years ago because she passed away back in 2019. And whenever I hear your intro song, "Oh to Pleasure," it always takes me back to better days. So if you could do me a favor and not change that intro theme. But
Well, we're hoping to get a pleasure back.
yeah.
Copyright is now run by artificial intelligence program at YouTube, and they have no way when it's wrong of correcting it.
Mhm.
So what happened was we had to stop running the O of Pleasure,
Right.
and we're jumping through hoops with the owner of it, and we will have it back in a few weeks.
However, I'm aware that your wife passed some time ago, and if you're comfortable, could you describe how important she was in terms of helping you with your writing and supporting you in terms of coming to terms with the visitor experience?
Anne was without Anne, none of this could have happened. Anne, who you see, excuse me, behind me,
Hmm.
uh, was the one who said, we have to call the book Communion because that's what it's about. And she was also the one who said, when I said, well, we have to go out in the woods at night to see if we can get them to return, and because we need to, I think we should try to have a relationship with them now. A few months had passed, and we knew they were real. And she said, okay, fine, you go out in the woods and I'll stay home and take care of our little boy. And was the one when the letters, unexpectedly, masses of letters began pouring in. This was before the internet, remember, from people who had had experiences, great piles of them being heaped on the floor of the living room by the mailman, postman.
Hmm.
Uh, and I said, we can't possibly read these. What are we going to do with them? Because they were incredibly intimate accounts that were also with people's names and addresses all over them. So we couldn't just discard them. I said, we can't possibly read all these. She said, well, you might not be able to, but I can. And she got her letter opener out and she started reading. She hired a secretary, Laurie Barnes, and they worked together for 15 years. And she collected all of these letters that are now in an archive at Rice University in Texas, a very prestigious university in America. And the one day, the most important single thing that ever happened in the whole experience for me, Anne came walking out of her office and she said, Whitley, this has got something to do with what we call death. And the addition of the idea of the dead in this whole experience is huge, huge. So this is not to do just with the mystery of the strange looking visitors. It's also to
Hmm.
do with the mystery of us, who we really are, what we are doing here, and what we what we are perhaps intended to eventually become.
Hmm.
And opened those questions. And I will leave you with a couple of things that this very wise woman said. She said, among other things, she said, the human species is too young to have beliefs. What we need are good questions. And if you look around at human culture across the world, it's filled with beliefs, none of which we can prove. None. So why don't we throw all that out and start over again?
Hmm.
Then another thing she said, Anne was toward the end of her life, she became enlightened in the classic way of real enlightenment. And I asked her what it was. I said, what is enlightenment? And she said, enlightenment is what happens when there's nothing left of you but love. I asked her
Yeah.
about compassion because it's so essential. If you're going to become a truly loving human being, you can't do it without compassion. And when I
That's
asked her,
true.
what is compassion? She said simply, each of us is all we have. And if you look at the other person with that thought in your mind, every single one, no matter how you feel about them, changes and becomes something precious.
Yeah, those are wise words. Willie, your stories have entertained and fascinated me since I was a kid. So it was a pleasure having you on.
Thank you for having me.
Is there anything else? Is there anything you'd like to promote or tell the audience about before you go?
Well, I just finished a new book called Transformation 2025, which is the book I wrote, the second book I wrote after communion. It was buried by the media, and then I've revised it up to 2025 because it is the first detailed account of what it is like for a family to live with and engage with these strange beings. And there's never been anything else like it to this day. So I'm trying to reintroduce it to the world in hopes that people will get to read it this time, which they did not the last.
Again, thank you for coming on, and goodbye.
Thank you.
Yep. And that was Whitley Strieber, everybody. And next week we have Eva Lorgen coming on, and she'll be describing her experiences with MyLabs. And if you enjoyed the episode, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. And if you want to donate, you can go to buymeacoffee.com/Caledonian Elixir. So that was an interesting episode, and I hope you enjoyed. Until next week.
Gold pressed platinum, slip strips and bars. If you ever find some, you can lose it in quarks. Get a Ractogino, spin the double wheel. Hold her a black hole, just depends how you feel. Yeah, it just depends how you feel. Gold pressed platinum, you know it's a gas. Morn vomits it up into a tiny little glass. Liquid platinum, more you amass. Better than bronze, cobalt, silver, nickel or brass. Silver, nickel or